China says it will reciprocate with countermeasures against the United States if Washington moves forward with more tariffs in the trade war with Beijing. Hello, I'm Nathan King, sitting in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. Hello again. Delegations from Beijing and Washington are expected for trade talks in September after speaking this week by phone. The Trump administration says the talks were productive and announced the delay of some tariffs on Chinese electronics, toys, etc., for the busy holiday shopping season here in the US. But the US is expected to move forward with a 10% tariffs on other goods on September 1st. China says it's fully prepared to respond and is suspending purchases of US agricultural products. For more on the trade dispute, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Beijing is Gong. He's Professor of Economics at the University of International Business and Economics. And from Portland, Oregon, we have Liang. She is an Associate Professor of Economics at Willamette University. Here in the studio, no stranger to the show, is Jeff Moon. He has served as Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for China and is an international trade consultant. And from Miami, Remi Piet. He is a Research Associate on Political Economy and Foreign Policy at Florida International University. Welcome to you all. Gong, I'm going to put you on the spot in Beijing first of all, because we haven't actually heard what countermeasures Beijing is yet to announce. What can we expect over the coming days from Beijing? Their responses seem to have been a little measured so far in this now nearly 2-year-old tit for tat. What have they got left?
Well, before President Trump announced that he is going to delay some of the tariffs he announced earlier, Beijing said very clearly that it is going to retaliate. But since then, there's some changes in Washington. Some of the tariffs are going to be postponed. But according to reports, China hasn't responded with anything sort of in U.S. favor so far. My guess is that Beijing's position is that these tariffs are announced in the first place by Washington, and now they're scaling back a little bit. Why should we respond? I mean, that's I think is Beijing's position. So we'll see. We haven't seen any official reports from the government yet. But in any case, they're going to meet. They're going to meet in first week of September, reportedly. So we're going to see what's going to happen in the next few days. Yeah, let's hope there's progress, and I presume just a halting agricultural imports like soybeans is a response in itself. Jeff Moon, I've been confused the last couple of weeks because there's been so many twists and turns to this. There always are, but it seems to have intensified. When U.S. President Donald Trump basically announced that the remaining 300 billion of Chinese imports would be tariffed. That was a bit of a shock because we thought we'd reached another consensus at the G20 in Osaka, and then he backtracked because it's the busy holiday shopping season here, and computers and stuff like that were going to be tariffed before that, and then he said this, and I'm just going to pick up off the back of it with a question.
We're doing this for Christmas season, just in case some of the tariffs would have an impact on U.S. customers, which so far they've had virtually none. The only impact has been that we've collected almost $60 billion from China, compliments of China.
So he seems to be saying there that he's not imposing these tariffs because it could affect the American consumer with higher prices, but then still maintains that China is paying the tariffs in the same sentence. And this has created a bit of confusion. Where is the Trump administration at the moment?
Well, they send a lot of confused signals, and that has confused the stock market and observers like us. But what's really happening here is that this last tranche of $300 billion would cover all consumer goods that American consumers would be buying for the Christmas season. And so every single American consumer would have to reach into his or her pocket to pay extra during Christmas to pay for these extra tariffs. I think Trump realized that. He wanted to pull back. I think another thing is going on is that on the Chinese side, essentially China just wants to stall the process until October 1st. This is a very sensitive period for China domestically. There is a 70th anniversary of the People's Republic on October the 1st. Lots of preparations. The theme is national rejuvenation, and any concessions to foreigners are completely unacceptable. And you also have the Hong Kong crisis. There have been Taiwan arms sales. There are a variety of reasons why I think Chinese leadership has no flexibility, and Trump may have realized that there's limited flexibility there and therefore reduced some of the tariffs. In fact, I'm a little surprised in light of all that he didn't remove the entire 300, that he's still going to go ahead with 120 billion.
Yeah, because a lot of those are still consumer goods as well, not the intermediate goods that have been tariffed essentially up until now. Yang Yung in Portland, Oregon, I have to go to you. Do you see an end to this in sight? Because, as Jeff said, there are definite domestic concerns in China right now. There are domestic concerns here in the US as we're rapidly entering the last year of election season, which seems to go on and on and on. Are both sides dug in, or could we see a deal considering the wobbling we're seeing in the US economy and the global economy too?
I think you just mentioned that this is really a lot of twist and turn in the past weeks, and what we have seen is that, after the Osaka meeting, after the trade talks in Shanghai, very abruptly, I think Trump announced the new tariffs, and I think that really discouraged further productive conversations on both sides. Now, China now seems to adopt a wait it out kind of approach, waiting to respond. Like Jeff mentioned, they wanted to pass that October 1st, very sensitive political moment, and they also wanted to wait it out until maybe when Trump heading into 2020 and make some concessions, trying to finish the trade negotiations to get a trade deal. On the other hand, I think Trump has been applying.
Sorry, do interrupt. Do you think Beijing might want to wait for a Joe Biden presidency, or do you think it could wait that long?
I think that's in their calculations, although it's very hard to say whether Democrats would actually be easier when it comes to trade negotiations.
Right.
But I think from Trump's perspective, from what we have seen in the past few weeks, is he seemed to kind of rush to apply the maximum pressures on Beijing and trying to get a trade deal. He has taken a series of actions, labeling China as a currency manipulator, announcing the new tariffs, and so on and so forth. I think the reason that he postponed some of the tariffs is not really trying to do a favor to Beijing, but really to his business communities and American consumers after all.
Yeah, there's been a lot of pressure from the US Chamber of Commerce and others, especially in the tech sector as well. Remi, I just want to go to you and take a sort of more global look. Obviously, the two biggest economies fighting like this means everyone else gets involved as well, and there is collateral damage. How dangerous is it globally now, considering the uncertainty that the US-China trade war is around the world?
Well, if you're looking at the impact on other economies, the main source of concern is obviously the uncertainty in terms of global growth. So that actually limits a series of investment in different economies that just are not convinced that there will be an increase of purchasing power in China and in the US, and therefore investors prefer to remain on the sideline. However, if you actually look at from the European perspective, once you see at the same time an escalation of trade conflict between China and the US, you have a European Union that actually multiplies the different trade agreements with other partners. And the European Union has signed agreements recently with Canada, with the CETA. They actually just officialized an agreement with Mercosur, Latin American countries, just ahead of the G20. So you have countries that actually are looking on the sideline that maybe gaining from trade diversion of this strong level of conflict between the US and China, and some economies are doing much better than some others. I mean, Germany is going to be impacted. They already have seen a decrease of their growth and actually a shrinking by 0.1% last quarter. But some other economies, France actually revealed the best figures in terms of unemployment and investment in industry over the last 10 years. So it's really depending on where are those countries located in terms of their agenda, their policies in terms of trade, and how they will be able to answer the evolution of the global economy.
Yeah, and it's worth pointing out that I think it was Chad Bown at the Peterson Institute for Economics said that China's lowering tariffs against with everyone except the US at the moment. And that's where I want to pick up, John Gong. Let me just play you this from the Chinese Ministry of Commerce and ask about sort of the strategy going forward from Beijing.
The U.S. actions of unilateralism, bullying, and protectionism have spoiled the atmosphere of China-U.S. trade consultations and are not conducive to solve the trade disputes between the two sides, and China firmly opposes to these actions. China will never accept pressures and threats of other countries and will not compromise on the issues of principle under U.S. pressure and unilateralism. If the U.S. insists on escalating the trade disputes, then China will have to take countermeasures.
And I want to ask you off the back of that, because it's not just the tariffs, is it? For example, in the last 10 days or so, the US has labeled China a currency manipulator, even though the US Treasury had said just a few months before that it wasn't manipulating its currency, as the RMB level against the dollar fell below 7. Is China devaluing its currency, or is this just market reaction to the fact that everyone wants dollars right now, flight to quality?
Well, it dropped from 6.8 to 7. You know, that's merely a 3% drop. How much of it is driven by central bank's policy? How much of it is a reaction to the market? You know, it's very difficult to tell. I think it's going to be a mix of both. And in any case, it's not much of a big deal here. I mean, a normal market fluctuation in a day could be something more than 3%. And in addition to this, and if you look at the Treasury Department's historic practices regarding this issue, they have a 3-factor analysis, and in this case, only one criteria is met. So, you know, this whole idea about accusing China of being a currency manipulator is just groundless. And I think Secretary Mnuchin knows that. And I think if you read his tweets very carefully, he said, you know, clearly that he said it's an auspices of the White House. So he's sort of telling people that, you know, this is done by the White House. It's not my fault. And I think President Trump is doing this to really fulfill one of his campaign promises. Now, back in 2016, he has this document called Contract with American Voters, in which he explicitly said that he's going to label China a currency manipulator. Now, we have to remember that President Trump has been pretty good on delivering his campaign promises so far. So I think this got to be on his mind when he did this. He sees this as an opportunity, and he sees it. So I think this is more of a sort of a political play with his political base, as opposed to really, you know, following the law, the 2015 Trade Facilitation Trade Enforcement Act, where they explicitly mention these 3-factor analysis, and in this case, 2 of them actually are not met at all.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I wanted to go to Jeff Moon about that. You know, this is the time in a president's term where you start looking at the pledges and working out whether he's fulfilled them or not, and getting tough on China. Talked about that, but we're in the middle of a tariff war. There's a techno war as well. If you look at Huawei, ZTE, all the measures coming in, and then this sort of list of things that the US has sort of demanded from China, including structural reforms, changes in laws, which we've seen tremendous pushback from Beijing on. Have they succeeded anywhere yet?
Well, I think they've got the Chinese attention for the first time. We had 20 or 30 years of negotiations.
All of our attention.
True, but 20 or 30 years of negotiations. China promised 20 years ago to become a market-based economy. It did not. We've been pressing these demands for many, many years, and it seems like they're finally taking it seriously. So they have not yet succeeded in making the changes that need to be made, but going forward, we'll just have to see. And frankly, if this tariff war does not succeed in making these changes, I predict what's going to happen is we're going to move into an age of reciprocity, where the American side looks at the extent to which the Chinese side is open, that market is open. If it's not open, we'll start taking reciprocal measures. You know, the deal that we struck 20 years ago for China to come into the WTO was with a developing country. Now China, as the world's second largest economy, needs to open its markets, and if it doesn't, then it will cease to have the advantages it has in Western markets.
Quick follow-up on that then. I mean, what's the risk then to the sort of globalized economy that we know? Because as we're seeing with these 10% tariffs that have been delayed, people rely on the global supply chain to basically get the stuff they need.
Well, there are a number of risks here. Global supply chains de facto are changing as we speak.
Well, they're always changing, aren't they?
But they're dramatically shifting, and they're shifting outside of China. The greater damage, of course, is to the rules-based global trading system.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure that system can recover if this goes on for too long. That's my greatest fear.
And where do you see this going in terms of the other demands from the Trump administration when it comes to structural reforms in China and a different way of doing business? Or are those reforms being actually put in place, albeit not at a pace that Washington wants?
I think some of Trump's demands for structural reforms are in line with China's long-term interest. So things like banned forced technology transfer, respect intellectual property rights, and protect intellectual property rights. I think all of these are in line with China's long-term interest as China wants to develop its domestic technology. But there are other structural reforms, such as reducing state support, especially when it comes to technological development. I think it's very difficult for China to swallow. I think this is a clash between different economic and social systems. I don't think the U.S. is in a position to really tell China what to do when it comes to its industrial policy. I think after all, the U.S. itself is supporting its leading technological sectors and using industrial policies to support, for example, its farming community. And I also want to make the point that I think, Trump has been very critical of the global multilateral trading system, and he has threatened to withdraw from WTO and so on and so forth. But I think once we are in the system, China has delivered its promises since the accession to WTO, and it has recently also announced the opening of its financial markets in 2020, a year earlier than its schedule. I think China has been very pragmatic and very measured when it comes to opening and reforming its economy. I think we do need to give the time. After all, it's still a developing country. Its per capita GDP is only 1/6 of the U.S.'s. Talking about reciprocity without considering the country's developmental stages, its market conditions, I think is really problematic.
Remi, do you see the United States being able to fulfill the sort of bilateral approach and moving away from the international financial architecture that's essentially built up since World War II? It seems that the architect has decided to go and build a new house, wanting these bilateral deals with, for example, the UK when it comes out of the European Union, or Japan, others as well. Is that possible, and what are the effects of that?
I mean, this is the key paradigm shift that we've seen with the Trump administration. The turning its back from the multilateral perspective of building international trade, a globalized world where investments and global growth could actually benefit and eventually trickle down to the lowest level of population with limiting inequality if possible on this one. We're having a Trump administration that moved away from this and just moves forward with a America First platform under Trump, and that's clearly his motto and his discourse to his electoral basis. Clearly, Trump is looking forward to 2020. He's trying to make a point to his electoral basis that he's being tough on China. I actually assume that ahead of the 2020 elections, he will come up with some kind of a half-baked measure of saying that I've forced China to cave on some limited points, although he will not have created anything very systematic in terms of the changes, but he's going to try to sell it to the American people ahead of the elections. Now, the issue is to look at what kind of impact it will have had on the globalized world. The idea here was to try to have collective regimes of fair trade and free trade that will limit the mercantilist perspective of some of the countries that will not play that game. And if you have the US move away from this perspective, promising some countries, such as you mentioned, the new administration of Boris Johnson in Great Britain, that they will, try to find, bilateral perspective of working on trade. I mean, clearly the British start to realize that this is not going to be in the best advantage of the British either, because each country plays its own, own set of rules for its own objective. We've seen this in the 1930s. We've seen to which it was leading in terms of global security. The entire globalization movement after the Second World War was to foster global peace through peace theory on this one.
Yeah, I mean, trade doesn't happen in a vacuum, and obviously, China can take some of these opportunities too. Gong, it's not just trade, is it? As I just said, it's kind of a whole government approach, as the Vice President said in that speech last year. There is trade pressures, obviously, from the US and technological pressure, but also political pressure, rhetorical pressure when it comes to Hong Kong. And then just in the last 24 hours or so, we've learned that the very contentious arms sales of over 60 F-16s is going to be pushed through by the Trump administration for Taiwan. How's this resonating in Beijing, this sort of tension on all fronts?
Well, it's unfortunate that the United States views China currently as a competitor, also an adversary. So there are multiple fronts at this point that United States is engaged in sort of confronting or dealing with China, and the trade is the main battleground. But also there are other theaters where the U.S. governments are engaged in skirmishes with China. As you mentioned, Hong Kong. It's actually quite interesting to read President Trump's series of tweets regarding Hong Kong. It seems to me that he views Hong Kong sort of as a bargaining chip. He even mentioned whether President Xi is willing to have a personal talk again about Hong Kong. So he clearly views this as a bargaining chip. And also, it indicates to me that he's probably more eager to reach a deal here than President Xi. And you also mentioned the arms sales of F-16s to Taiwan. This is something complicating the trade negotiation. I think from China's perspective, if you judge from the past experiences, I think these things cannot be separated. I think China's government has always been very adamant about maintaining this bottom line, especially regarding the issue of Taiwan. But the good news is that these arms sales to Taiwan really doesn't make much of a difference in terms of China's defense posture towards Taiwan. They don't make much of a difference. These planes, I don't think they match up to the state of the art jet fighters from China. But I think President Trump is doing this mostly for economic reason. He likes to peddle arms sales around the world. He calls them, beautiful weapons. He has been selling this stuff to Saudi Arabia, to other countries, and Taiwan is an easy target. He's selling these things for billions and billions of dollars to Taiwan. But in conclusion, all these things are related. These are multiple fronts, and they're just complicating the current negotiation.
Jeff, it's in certain Chinese circles and on social media, there's this sort of hashtag blame China, and you look at the US economy right now. After 10 years of recovering from the worst recession since the 1930s, there seems to be a bit of a tipping point. We've talked about the inverted yield curve this week. We've seen some jitters in the stock market. Spending is through the roof. The debt is through the roof. Is the US economy on the brink of recession? And how, and I know that's a very difficult question to answer, and how much is Trump's trade policy adding to the likelihood of that? And could we see actually a Trump recession before his re-election? Because that would really be a game changer in terms of negotiating with China too, wouldn't it?
Well, it's not really clear whether there will be a recession or not. The yield curve this week briefly inverted for a half a day.
Yes.
And that has been a signal traditionally, but it's come back.
And that's essentially when long-term interest rates actually go below short-term interest rates, which is weird because you normally get more interest to counter for inflation and stuff like that. So it's a kind of indication that people are worrying there's going to be no growth and no investment, right?
Well, people are worried about that. But there are lots of conflicting signals. I mean, there have been good earnings. The American economy is the strongest economy in the world, I think, bar none.
But growth, I mean, it was 3%. GDP growth now, it's more like 2%. Investment, I mean, retail's great, but the consumer keeps spending all the time until there's no money left, right? I mean, in America. So Are there worrying signs for you?
Well, there are a lot of mixed factors. There was a tax cut last year that contributed to the 3%. But yes, the tariffs, if you put tariffs on 250 billion or even more in terms of imports that are coming in, that's going to have a drag on the economy. There is no doubt about it. And we've seen the stock market fluctuate by 500 points both ways every day this week practically. And a lot of that has to do with the China trade war. So there's a lot of uncertainty in the United States, and that has ripple effects, as we've heard, to Europe and other parts of the world. We need to solve this trade war problem. There's no doubt about it.
Right, Remi, I'm going to put you on the spot as the last word or so. Speaking as a sort of neutral observer in terms of the US and China, do you see a limited trade deal in the next year or 6 months to a year? Do you see a more structural, move to a sort of structural conversation, or do you think it's going to be more of the same?
And what I see into this is that the development in terms of foreign policy and global economy on the Trump administration is always been like 2 steps forward and 1 step back, and it's going to be much more decided by evolution of electoral perspective in 2020, the capacity to maybe have some kind of concession from China, either on intellectual property or on some specific bilateral deal in terms of agricultural products that will actually answer to a specific electoral basis in the US. Whether we're looking at a large scale trade agreement between China and the US, that's unlikely to happen because that's not the way that Trump actually operates. He's going to be looking at small pragmatic victory and try to sell it over the top to its electoral basis. Unfortunately, it's not going to be as efficient as what we've seen over the last decade also of having China enter into a much more globalized discussion of how to develop international regimes and very much clearer perspective for investor, and that's going to be a strong impact on global economy in the coming months, definitely.
And final word, Yang, do you think that China is going to be able to weather this, considering the slowing growth that we've seen, and of course some of the debt problems that we're seeing come to the surface now?
This is a great question. I think people are talking about how China can retaliate, through currency devaluation, through reducing agriculture purchases, reducing the exports of rare earths, and so on and so forth. But I think the key really for China is to sustain its economic growth through domestic, macroeconomic and industrial policies. I think so long as China can strengthen its economy and grow in a healthy manner, China can win the trade war without claiming victories on these various battlegrounds. And I also wanted to add, I am not as optimistic about, whether or not this trade war is going to really drag down the global economy. The IMF just reduced the growth forecast for 2019 from 3.5% to 3.3%. The U.S. economy and Chinese economy are, of course, the biggest casualties from this trade war. But we also see other trade-dependent countries like Singapore and Germany. They are also on the brink of recession. And Germany is the pillar of the European economy. So I think the two countries really need to work together to avoid a global recession.
Yeah, if Washington and Beijing sneeze, the rest of the world gets a cold, that's for sure. Thank you so much from you in Oregon, and of course our guests in Beijing and Florida, and Jeff here in the studio. That's all we've got time for on this edition of The Heat. I'm Nathan Kidd in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.